morning and a very warm welcome to this EPC update, our regular look at key developments in and around the European Union in the time of the COVID-19 pandemic. My name is Jacki Davis and I have the privilege every time we meet of moderating these discussions. And with me this week, as always, delighted to welcome Janis Emmanouilidis, Director of Studies at the EPC, and Chief Executive Fabian Zuleeg, and our guest this week, joining us later on to discuss the state of play in the negotiations on the new Pact for Migration and Asylum and the new Schengen strategy proposals, are Helena Hahn, Junior Policy Analyst, and Alberto-Horst, Neidhardt, Policy Analysts, both in the EPC's European Migration and Diversity Programme. Housekeeping before we start. As always, totally interactive discussion, questions from me to our speakers, and I hope later from all of you. You're all muted for now. If you want to write your question, click on the Q&A button, not the chat button, the Q&A button, and please be as brief as possible so I can see at a glance who your question's for and what you want to know. If you prefer to speak, click on the raise hands button at the bottom of the screen and I will come to you and I will allow you to talk. No need to put your camera on. Let's minimize the chances of technology going wrong. If you have IT issues you need help, please use the chat button. Okay. Let's get straight underway because we have a lot of ground to cover this week. And Janis, let me come to you first and let's talk COVID before anything else. And on the COVID certification rollout, the European Parliament approved the deal that was struck this week. About a third of member states are already beginning to join or say they're tech ready. Are we on course for July 1 for it to be fully operational? And what will that mean? Is it going to be accompanied in any way by any common agreement on what we use, precisely how it's used?
Well, first of all, it's good news that it has passed the European Parliament, because I think also for those who are started to travel around Europe, you can see in what mess we still are when you enter one country from another. So to get the certificate, I think is very good news. Yes, there is progress. There actually now are 12 EU member states which are linked to the EU gateway and have started to issue the certificate. Among them, the Baltic countries, Germany, Poland, Greece, Spain, Denmark, and others. So we're seeing that there is a rollout. We see that those who have been also very positive about the certificate from the beginning are among the first who have been, who are ahead of the others. But I'm confident that others will follow because there is now an increasing pressure. Also at national level, seeing that others are having their certificate, which actually I think will make travel easier. So there is pressure also on national governments to follow suit of those who are ahead. There still are some technical issues, also at individual member state level, for how people will be able to acquire the certificate, especially for those who are not technical savvy. But I think these difficulties can be overcome. I think the biggest challenge is the fact that some member states might, at the end of the day, decide to put in place some specific national measures. Because as we all know, the European Parliament were asking for the member states not having the opportunity to put in place additional restrictions. But the European Parliament did not win that fight. So member states can, if they wish, impose additional restrictions if they think that that's necessary to protect public health. So this, I think, is the biggest thing to look at. Technically, I think that things will progress. There's a good chance that it will work. It might have some hiccups here and there. But the question is, will some member states want to go beyond what has been agreed, which is that once you have the certificate, and there are 3 reasons how you can get the certificate, that will be enough to be able to travel. But I think that, and I'll finish with that, the political pressure is now high on member states because you have the certificate, you found an agreement in the Council with the European Parliament. There was an agreement that the certificate should help to ease travel. Yeah. And so I think that there's much more pressure now on member states to adhere to the certificate working and not to imposing additional national specific restrictions.
Thank you very much. And related also to COVID, Fabian, if I could come to you, we had a Eurobarometer survey this week, which on the face of it does not look good. 50% of Europeans said they were dissatisfied with the EU's handling of the pandemic. But quite strikingly, and this survey was done in March, April, when things really weren't good in relation to the vaccine in Europe, 48% were satisfied. So on the one hand, you may say, well, 50%, half the population thinking the EU has not delivered a satisfactory response, but quite surprisingly high on the other side. And just one other survey to mention of 12 countries, they were asked to describe the state of the EU, and a majority in France, in Germany, in Italy, in Spain, said the EU was broken. But interestingly, again, they also said they wanted it fixed. They weren't suggesting in any way that that meant one should leave it. It meant the EU should get its act together. How do you read those results, Fabian? I mean, I say you could look at it both ways. It's very bad for the EU, or it's not as bad as it might have been.
Well, I think firstly, yes, it is a very exceptional situation. So we should not overinterpret the results, and they will change over time. But on the other hand, I think we do need to take that seriously. We need to see that people around Europe are making a judgment. I think one important point, which is highlighted by this, is that the debates we're having at the European level about whose competences these are, who's responsible for that, don't really get reflected with citizens. Citizens see, does it work, does it not work? And if it doesn't work, they feel it is the EU which is not working. And in some ways, they are right, because, of course, the EU is also the member states. But I think what this highlights really is that in some ways, we don't have a choice but to get it right now. It has to function now. It has to be seen to be functioning now. And I think what Janis was talking about in terms of the certificate, in terms of travel, Europeans are very, very keen on being able to travel again this summer. It is a very important thing for many Europeans to also be able to go across borders. And if we have this uncertainty, if we have a situation where people have to go into quarantine because they didn't really realize the restrictions which were being imposed by a country, or if restrictions are imposed in the middle of the holiday period when people are still abroad, I think this is going to reflect very badly on the European Union. So I think, yes, even the ones which have had a more negative view can still be convinced, but we have to get it right now. And I think if we are not getting the summer period right, I would very much fear that we have a permanent damage.
So as you say, too early, but this will be a big test of it. Janis, your analysis and what the long-term implications of this might be for the EU, but also a word, if you would, on France, because the worst results were in France, with, I think, something like only 17% supporting the EU as it is. People saying this is very ominous in terms of the French presidential elections, in terms of Marine Le Pen's chances of victory. So how do you read it on an EU level, and how do you read those French results?
Yes, on the EU level, as you said, I think it is somewhat surprising that the numbers in terms of dissatisfaction, satisfaction did not change very much in March, April compared to the end of last year, given the hiccup with the vaccination process. However, I think one needs to be really careful not to misinterpret these numbers. Fabian is right. There still is a test ahead of us in terms of how things will work over the upcoming months when it comes to travel. So there's a link also to the certificate. But people will also be testing the European Union and its ability to deal with the corona crisis in a longer perspective, because the impact of the crisis, especially the economic, the societal, the socio-economic impacts, will still be felt. So they will be judging as to whether what we call the next generation EU, a recovery plan, people don't know that it's called that way, whether actually that works. So I have sometimes the impression that in Brussels, one underestimates the negative sentiments at national level. Also, if you talk to multipliers, if you talk to people who are dealing with these issues, they will tell you that at the national level, there is a very negative sentiment with respect to the EU's track record when it comes to dealing with the COVID-19 situation. Now, one can argue that that is overly negative, because I think that the overall track record is not as bad. However, there is this negative sentiment, and I think one needs to be aware of that. There's one other thing which relates to France. which I think is an interesting finding which people were not referring to, because people were also asked whether they have knowledge about measures and actions which have been initiated by the EU to respond to the coronavirus pandemic. And there you see that there are enormous discrepancies between member states. And France is among those countries where people are not aware that there have been measures and actions taken by at the European level. It's the second lowest after Denmark with 37%. Other member states, Slovenia, 71%, Germany, 63%. But in France, the level of acknowledgement of the fact that there have been measures taken at the European level is very low. And I think that's one reason also why there is a negative sentiment in France with respect to the EU's ability to deal or not to deal with the crisis.
And that raises questions about member states and the way they communicate what they're doing and what the EU level is doing. But quite striking, I mentioned the second survey of 12 countries talking about the EU being broken. Many of them also felt their national governments were broken. Yes. So it's not just an EU phenomenon, but it is more exaggerated at the EU level. Fabian, you wanted to come back in?
Yeah, just to make a couple of points on where I think we need to very much watch at the European level. One is that we are often very good at agreeing something, but then in the implementation, that's where we're lacking. And for something like Next Generation EU, this money has to actually get on the ground. We have to actually see the spending. Now we've had the own resources decision, so technically there's nothing in the way anymore. So we need to see that it actually happens, and then that also there's a recognition that this is European money and that this is not something which is just done at the national. Second thing I think is adapting, changing, scaling up if necessary. This crisis is not over. In some ways, when we're talking about the economic crisis, we're still at the beginning. So we will need to have to adapt to whatever comes next. And sometimes I feel that on the health dimension, on the economic dimension, on all of the dimensions of the crisis, we're not anticipating enough about what is going to come next. We already can see that in many places we have very, very worrying variants of the COVID-19 virus. The question is, are we preparing for that? Are we actually gearing up for the production capacity, for the research which might be needed to produce a different vaccine, which can actually address a virus variant which is no longer covered by the current vaccine? These are the kind of questions which I think we really need to address in advance, not retrospectively, because retrospectively will just deepen the dissatisfaction of citizens.
And that's quite striking because Charles Michel has talked about at the next week's summit, there should be a reflection on lessons learned. But you're saying, hang on, it's not just about lessons learned for a future pandemic. We're not out of this one yet, and we're not preparing for the next stages. It'd be interesting to see whether that gets picked up. Janis, a quick one, if you would, because then I want to move on to a couple of other issues.
Yes, I think that Fabian is right. The final verdict is still out. And I think that should be one lesson of what we have gone through over the past 1.5 years. That we should not consider that if we enter now a post-COVID-19 situation, which we will be entering, that means that the effects of the crisis are behind us. That would be a big wrong lesson if that's what we would do. Now, just one remark, because you were referring to that to the second survey, and to people also feel that the national systems are broken. And often when you hear the figures on dissatisfaction, you have a reflex, which you also hear often from the Brussels scene, that, well, look, at the national level also people feel that things are broken, as if this would be good news.
Yes,
which is exactly the wrong thing to argue, because if national systems are broken, that also has negative effects at the European level, because the EU is a composite of the member states, as Fabian was saying earlier. So if you should not be happy if you have problems at the national level, because it equally has a negative potential effect on the European level, and we're seeing that, and we have seen that.
Absolutely, and interesting also because sometimes that has led in the past to increased support for the EU, because if you think your national system is broken, you look to the EU level to try and fill those gaps. So as you say, the idea that this is good news, slightly strange. Fabian, I'm afraid we have to turn to your and my least favorite topic, the matter of, I'm not going to call it Brexit, I'm going to call it EU-UK relations. We've had a very bad week. It's really kicked off with that article by David Frost which I think went down, as we say in English, like a lead balloon in Brussels, and really no sign of any progress at the talks. I mean, I'm particularly struck by a phrase that is being used by the British government now about accusing the EU of legal purism. Now, as far as I can tell, legal purism means abiding by the treaty you signed up to and following the rules you agreed. But do they have a point at all? And is there any way, I mean, we look as if we're headed to a very bad place, a potential of retaliatory measures on both sides. There were hints of it from Šefčovič, from Frost this week. Where are we and where are we going, do you think?
Thanks, Jackie. Yes, unfortunately, we're going to have to continue returning to this topic, I think also in future. Just one comment which also applies to the UK, which I think in the context of what we were just talking about, if national systems are broken or if citizens feel national systems are broken and they don't have the EU to turn to or they don't want to turn to the EU, who do they turn to? And I think this is a question which we are going to have to answer on the UK level, but also on the EU level, because I think the answer potentially is populists. It's people who have easy solutions, and that I think is very dangerous. But on the EU-UK relationship, yes, we've had this escalation where both sides are accusing each other. I think we have seen also a significant escalation in the communications battle, with Šefčovič going on to UK television. I think this is fairly unprecedented, that there is a need from the EU side, which is felt that you have to defend the EU position, that the EU position also has to be in the British debate, and essentially the two positions are mutually incompatible. The UK is saying that the EU is risking peace in Northern Ireland by being too legalistic, by being too pure, as you said it. And the UK is, and the EU is saying, no, we are insisting on the implementation of what has been signed up. Now, I think in an ideal world, and I'm not saying this to excuse the UK actions, but in an ideal world, we would have a cooperative relationship where we would sit down together and try to find some practical technical solutions to some of these issues. I don't think that is impossible, but at the moment, there is neither the trust nor the willingness from both sides to actually do that. I think it requires the UK side to make a real commitment to the protocol and to make it publicly. We cannot have the situation where we continue to have a threat of not implementing what you have signed. I think that is anathema to the EU member states and the institutions. And in the end, I think this also highlights that there's a completely different philosophy. The EU is a community of law. You follow the law. There cannot be lax interpretation of the law. There cannot be the kind of flexibility the UK is talking about, because that in the end would question the whole framework of the European Union.
But as you say, there could be some technical, practical ways to implement it in as light a way as possible. But until you get round the table and talk seriously, not going to happen. One more issue before we bring Alberto and Helena in, and Janis, something that I'm just a bit intrigued about, which was the decision by the European Commission this week to take Germany to court over its constitutional court ruling on the ECB, European Central Bank's bond buying program. Now, this issue caused a huge furore at the time of the initial court ruling. It then appeared to have been resolved. They appear to have found a way to satisfy the court, but also to protect the ECB and protect its independence and its capacity to act. And now the Commission launches legal action. Why pick this fight now? What is behind this?
Well, first of all, you're right, it is a tricky case. And there are some who are arguing, was this the right action? Was this the right moment? Was this opportune for the Commission to notify Germany, the German government, that there might be possible infringement procedure? However, I think that if you think it through, at the end of the day, it was the right thing to do. And I think there are two perspectives on the case. And from the European perspective, it was clearly the right thing to do for a number of reasons. One, what happened with the decision coming from Karlsruhe last year was that it undermined what Fabian just called the community of law. It undermined potentially the EU's legal order, which is relying on the supremacy of EU law. What Karlsruhe was saying, that the ECJ's decision on ECB, a bond buying program, was ultra vires, was beyond its legal power. So they were challenging one of the fundamental principles of a community of law. And that was one reason. The other is that there's a danger, and we're seeing that already happening, that in other member states, constitutional courts might also follow suit, might also argue that this is that the supremacy of the ECJ can be cast into doubt. So I think that was the right thing to do in order to send that signal of, look, you cannot do that. And that also links to the no double standards issue. If they would not have gone along that route, how could they then have argued that they are doing it in similar cases in other countries, which now has happened also this week with respect to Poland? And let's not forget that Karlsruhe has undermined the ECB's monetary policy, which is an exclusive competence of the European Union. So I think that there are many reasons from an EU perspective arguing in the direction of going ahead with this process now, which has not been settled since last year. But then there's the German perspective.
Very briefly, if you would.
The final point, yes. Because now the question is, how shall the German government react to this? What should be the response? Without them potentially giving the impression that they're undermining the independence of the judiciary in Germany, the independence of the Bundesverfassungsgericht. That's why many think that what will come back from Berlin is that that the answer will be, well, we have no power to influence decisions taken by the Bundesverfassungsgericht. So how will that help the situation? And there is a danger that this might provoke Karlsruhe and lead to an outright confrontation. There is a danger that that will happen. I'm not saying that it will, because we have seen up till now, when we get to the point where you get into the corners, that Karlsruhe has reacted wisely at the end of the day.
But you are basically saying the Commission pretty much had no choice, or it was opening up a Pandora's box for the future by not acting. Fabian, very quick one if you would, because we need to move on.
Yeah, I mean, I think what to highlight here is this is pretty basic. The European Union functions because EU law stands over national law. If that is put into question, we don't have a European Union anymore. And I think that is as basic as it gets. The other point I wanted to make is it's not only about the legal order, it's also anticipatory, because the danger is that every time we're discussing something new, there's a voice which says, yeah, but will the Bundesverfassungsgericht agree to it? So if we are talking about next generation EU and we're finding that we need more money, we need to actually do more, then there will be voices which say, yes, but the Bundesverfassungsgericht has already said this far and not further. So I think this is also about enabling the European Union to act in future.
Okay. Thank you very much. I'm very glad you're both German speakers and are able to pronounce the name of the Constitutional Court. I'm not even going to attempt it. Thank you very much for that. But we want to move on now to discuss the new Pact for Migration and Asylum, the state of play in the negotiations, and also linking to what we were talking about earlier and the COVID digital certificates, the new Schengen strategy. And I'm delighted to see joining us on the screen, Helena, Hahn and Alberto. Very good to see you both. Let's jump straight in. And first of all, Alberto, can you give us a sense of where we are? We do not seem to be making much progress, although there was a glimmer of something at the Home Affairs Council meeting in Luxembourg this week, I believe. Where are we now?
Well, good morning, everyone, first of all. Well, it's no secret that the negotiations are progressing very slowly. Both Home Affairs Commissioner Ylva Johansson and also the Portuguese presidency have acknowledged these publicly. And the most divisive files where member states seem to be unable to reach a political agreement are the expanded use of the border procedures and the system which will replace the current Dublin framework, particularly in relation to questions of responsibility and relocations. However, as you said, there are signs that something may be happening behind the scene. And of course, the latest news is that Mediterranean countries may agree to drop the package approach and move forward with the creation of the European Union Asylum Agency. And this is significant, of course, but there are still questions, I think, about the implications and the long-term prospects of this flexibility. So I think on the one hand, there are reasons to be optimistic because, of course, this flexibility could usher in a period of change. If the package approach is dropped for all reform proposals, the negotiation of the most divisive files, some of which I just mentioned, may no longer hold progress on the whole package of reforms. On the other hand, I also want to highlight that I think there are reasons to be a little bit more cautious. So first of all, the files in the new pact are all interconnected. And so progress on individual files may be difficult without progress on the whole package. And second, in relation to the EU Agency for Asylum, but also the Eurodac fingerprinting system, which are the ones that the Commission would hope to drop or decouple from the rest of the package. These are two proposals that actually predate the new pact. And so nothing prevents member states from switching back to the package approach if and when these two reforms will be adopted.
And just to quickly follow up, Alberto, before I come to Helena, why, as I understand it, the Mediterranean countries had argued before, no, we have to take this as a package. As you say, they're all interconnected. They also feared losing leverage in some key areas. What's behind their change of heart? Is it simply a recognition that we're going to get nowhere unless we try something new? What do you think lies behind it?
I think there is a measure of that. I think there is a measure of pragmatism, which it is also reported to have to do with the current Italian government and with the pragmatism of Mario Draghi, the Prime Minister of Italy. I think there is also a sense that there is a growing urgency to move forward with the reforms because sooner rather than later, also the social economic impact of COVID-19 will kick in also in countries of origin and countries of transit. So I think there's a growing urgency to move forward with the reforms.
Absolutely. So ministers saying for now, oh, look, the flows are relatively low, but we are approaching the summer when traditionally we see that increase. And as you say, the COVID effect yet to play in. Helena, in terms of this more piecemeal approach, salami slicing, call it what you will, do you think this holds a key to the way forward? And how do you expect, I know the summit are they going to have a substantive discussion on this next week at the summit, or will it be just some conclusions? And how do you see the Slovenian presidency taking this forward?
Yeah, so thanks also and good morning to everyone. Maybe just very briefly on sort of the significance of the EUAA. I think here we really need to remember that in a letter that was even dated this week from the Med5, they emphasize the fact that they're willing to drop the package approach, but only if there's substantial progress on the solidarity front. So it's not necessarily just saying we're fine with delinking it and then let's see about other files. It's really that one has to go hand in hand with the other. And so I think it's maybe not such a easy job. So in terms of the outlook, in terms of also what we can expect for the next 6 months, I think there is reason to believe that, of course, with this momentum around the asylum agency, perhaps discussions will also progress on the Eurodac regulation. However, in a progress report by the Portuguese presidency from late May, they said essentially that they had discontinued negotiations or talks on the file. The reason why I think the Eurodac regulation specifically is really interesting is because it also relates, in my view, to some of Slovenia's other interests, specifically relating to enlargement. So we know that, of course, Slovenia has a broad range of interests in relating to the new pact, but of course, generally, its aims are, or it hopes to reduce irregular migration, prevent secondary movement. And this is where I think the Eurodac regulation plays a really interesting role. Because in relation to the Western or the Balkan states, there has been quite a bit of work ongoing in terms of setting up Eurodac-like models that would that would facilitate data exchange, around which, by the way, there are very grave concerns what that would look like. And so it could very well be that that is also behind the thinking of Slovenia pushing for an adoption.
But also could suggest this isn't the beginning of doing the next bit and the next bit, because as you say, very specific reasons for Slovenia to give this one priority. Before we delve into some of the detail, Janis and Fabian, and Janis, you indicated you wanted to come in, your overall assessment of the political state of play here. Janis.
I think that what Helena and Alberto have already highlighted is true. This is an extremely complicated file. We see how politically sensitive it is. We're fighting about it for years, even before the new pact was proposed. How to deal with issues of solidarity have been a core issue of divisions among member states. And there are a good number, let's not forget, of governments who actually do not want to have a real deal, because this is an issue which helps them at home to score, to politically score. But adding just one point to something which Alberto said, where he's totally right, that there is a pragmatist approach. There is pragmatism in what the Meds are doing, but there's also the tactical approach. And the idea is that if we signal our readiness to agree on Salami 1 and Salami 2, that might increase the pressure on others to actually deliver on the things which are important for them, which, as Helena was suggesting, is, at the end of the day, solidarity. So I think there's a lot of tactics in what we're seeing. I must say, and I hope that I will be wrong, I fear that it won't work out at the end of the day because the differences are so big. And I'm not sure that the tactics of saying we are now giving up on something in order to get something else will work out at the end of the day. I think it's much more complicated, much more difficult, unfortunately.
Thank you. And Fabian, to you in terms of, I mean, Janis make a point there about some governments don't want a deal. This is a good whipping boy, if you like. On the other side, and linking to what we talked earlier about the EU, you said this was a summer of test for the EU in relation to COVID. Is also another summer of tests for the EU in relation to this issue, because if the EU is yet again seen not to be able to come up with an answer together, and we'll come back to what might happen this summer, and we talked about populists and easy solutions. It is, I mean, we can't just keep kicking this down the road, can we, Fabian?
Well, unfortunately, the bit I was writing down to add to what Janis was just saying was exactly that, kicking the can down the road. Because in the end, it is politically too difficult. So there's a hope that it doesn't get too bad. Essentially, if there is a trickle of people across the Mediterranean, that's bad. But as long as it doesn't become too visible, then you will just live with it. That's a very cynical way of looking at it, because of course there's an enormous human cost associated with that. But I would think that in the end, we are talking about a situation where if it does become a real crisis again, then yes, action will follow. But as long as it keeps at this level, I'm rather pessimistic that we're going to see a lot of progress. But in the end, this is a very risky tactic, as we have known from the past, because the pressures which are there are not going to go away. So in future, we are going to have, at some point in time, another migration crisis. And then we are going to have to find ways of dealing with that, which are more long-term, more sustainable than what we are doing at the moment. But for the moment, I'm not very optimistic.
Alberto, on the short term, and then I'll ask you more about the long term, but this summer, as we say, numbers not so high. Fabian saying if they stay this way, then they will argue there will be no sense of urgency to do this. But how do you see the likely response this summer? What do we know about trends so far in terms of arrivals? And for example, what the EU might or might not do about search and rescue. We saw some very strong criticism from the UN High Commissioner back in May of the EU's approach here, and saying drowned refugee children on a beach in Libya was not a tragic anomaly, but a consequence of concrete decisions and policies that have been implemented. What do you think the short-term most likely response is? And then we'll come back to whether they can find a more permanent solution.
Yeah, first of all, to go back to what Fabian was saying just now, I think what is important to remember is that although the number of arrivals has constantly gone down since 2015, the proportion of persons dying while crossing the Mediterranean and while trying to reach the EU has actually gone up. So this is something going back to the question of the human tragedy and human costs of current policies that we ought to remember. Now, thinking about the short term, in the absence of an overall agreement on the package of proposals, what I think is likely to happen is that we will see a continuation of the approach of the last few years, which means that an attempt will be made to put in place some sort of a predictable but temporary system of disembarkation of relocation of those who have been rescued. And we know that the Commission has been pushing for these, and some member states, notably Germany and France, would support these. But of course, this would remain a voluntary system. So only willing states would be able to participate. And so I would like to highlight one point on this. When we look at concrete gestures, it appears really that solidarity has become a scarce resource in Europe. So for example, out of the thousands of people who have arrived in Italy in recent weeks, only Luxembourg, Lithuania, and Ireland have agreed to take about 30 persons who have been rescued. So I'm rather skeptic when it comes to a temporary solution based on goodwill.
And on search and rescue?
Yes, to answer to your question, I think because of these, the consequence of the inability of finding or not finding a common approach means that member states are unlikely to resume search and rescue operations in the Mediterranean or anywhere anytime soon.
Okay, and in the longer term, and then Helena, I'll come to you in terms of working with other countries on this issue, but in the longer term, Alberto, do you see any prospect of some agreement on a permanent redistribution system? Or do you think we are, as I think Janis and Fabian are both expressing a pessimism about this and saying, no, we're probably stuck with this ad hoc arrangement, which, as you say, is not working very well?
Yeah, well, I also don't see many great prospects for a permanent redistribution system being agreed anytime soon. So what I would like to focus now, I think, is on the new pact negotiations concerning those who are rescued after a search and rescue at sea, because this is one of the bones of contention in the overall discussion of the new pact. So some member states want a specific solidarity mechanism for search and rescue after disembarkation, while others actually reject these, and they want all of those who have been entering the EU irregularly to be subject to the same procedures, asylum and return procedures, but also to the same relocation system. And Slovenia actually belongs to the latter group and has been actually quite outspoken about these. So I'm not too hopeful that a compromise will be found during its presidency. Of course, I think this is actually rather frustrating because we've been waiting for years for a solution to determine whether there is a collective responsibility over those who are rescued. But again, I don't see how we're going to be able to move forward with these things.
Thank you. Helena, on the other side, what is often called the externalization of migration controls, do you think the EU will be able to achieve more in partnering with third countries, countries of origin, countries of transit, in terms of preventing irregular arrivals? I mean, this tends to be where the EU starts focusing when it can't agree on what it needs to do with those who do arrive. Is it a bit of a smokescreen, or can more be achieved in that area, do you think?
Yeah, well, I would maybe highlight two things here. So, of course, Commissioner Johansson has been really active already since, the last summer, where we also saw an increase in arrivals, though via other routes. And she's continued these, country visits, most recently, for instance, to Libya. She's also been to Tunisia several times with her Italian counterpart. And so this is very much, I think, part of an ongoing discussion, and it relates not only to reducing irregular migration, but also to a number of other areas. So, reducing youth employment in particular, development aid. So it really covers a broad range of things. And the external dimension is, of course, one area where a lot of member states are able to reach consensus. So we can expect to see ongoing efforts in the coming months there as well. I think one issue that is particularly, or that makes this not so much of an easy endeavor, is, of course, COVID-19. There were high expectations last spring, especially when it comes to EU-Africa cooperation, and these efforts to really engage in person as well and on really substantive issues, and negotiate the sticking point. So, on the one hand, having this emphasis on return and readmission, but also being able to offer, concrete legal migration pathways. I think this has been really hampered by COVID-19. And we continue, of course, to see that COVID-19 has had a lasting impact. And so I think this makes it a bit more difficult for the EU because it might also change the needs of partner countries. So it will have to tackle both support that it can offer in terms of recovery from COVID-19, as well as all of the other issues. So it's really looking at a very comprehensive package and weighing where it can have a regional approach, for instance, with North African countries, and where it will have to look specifically at, the tailor-made, well-balanced partnerships.
Thank you. Before I come back to Fabian and Janis on this, I just wanted to look at the flip side of this coin as well. A lot of emphasis put on, if you wish to curb irregular arrivals, you need to have more legal pathways for legal migration. In those terms, do you think what the EU is looking at in this area, what it's doing, and there is, of course, the Blue Card Directive and so on, do you think that those countries will see something that meets their hopes, their expectations, or is the EU on a path that will disappoint and therefore make the discussion on the irregulars more difficult because you're really not offering suitable regular alternatives?
I think that is really the big question. So of course, I think we need to remember that legal migration pathways should ideally cover all skill groups and not only highly qualified workers, as would be the case in with the Blue Card Directive. So of course, it's great that an agreement was reached on that, and there is a potential that this will have a greater impact also in terms of the numbers. But at the same time, there's still a big question around what to do with low-skilled workers, as well as how to maybe offer more tangible educational and training opportunities. And this is where I just briefly want to highlight that, of course, one idea is through the talent partnerships, which are being launched today. And those are supposed to offer both, on the one hand, a greater talent pool for EU recruiters, as well as tangible development benefits and increased skills on the sort of other side, on the partner country side. My personal opinion is that, based on the pilot projects that preceded these talent partnerships, I'm a bit cautious in terms of what the actual impact will be, partly also because we haven't quite, there hasn't been enough evaluation of the pilot projects. And I also think it raises bigger questions around what these goals will actually be. So is it mainly about education and skills? Is it mainly about sort of short stints, sort of exchanges? Or is it rather about perhaps developing a pathway for circular migration? And that, of course, relates then that for people participating in these talent partnerships, there also need to be tangible legal opportunities to prolong their stays in the European Union or to come back by
absolutely. And just one question on detail from our audience before I come back to Fabian and Janis, from Marie-Paul Bonnet, who says, any comments on the recent decision by the Danish Parliament regarding returns and use of third countries during the processing of asylum applications? Can either of you help with that one? Wave at me if you can. Helena, you're nodding, if not waving.
I think it's a big question and would deserve a discussion of its own. Of course, we have to remember here that no agreement between Denmark or another member state and a partner country has yet been met. As far as we know, at the moment, there's only a memorandum of understanding between Denmark and Rwanda, but there's no actual agreement, at least also in terms of operational, of the way that this would operationally be happen. Of course, it points to, an increasing reluctance to deal with migration, on the sort of domestic side. And I think we will really have to, there's a lot of questions around implementation. Not only does it relate to costs in terms of, there have been studies that have shown that externalizing actually then results in greater costs. And I'm not sure to what extent that will be considered or how that will be managed. There's, of course, political buy-in, willingness of the member of the partner countries to agree to something like that. Alberto.
Thank you. Alberto wanted to jump in.
No, briefly to add on what Helena was saying, I think it raises important legal questions as well about, for example, jurisdiction and whether, of course, the asylum processes conducted in the third country would actually have to respect EU law or the law of the country hosting these facilities. But I think the larger meaning of these, I think, is that this proposal has been advanced on the year which marks the 70th anniversary since the introduction of the Geneva Convention on the Status of Refugees. And I think this actually is a tragic symbol of the deterioration of the discussion, and also going back to what we were talking about before about the community of law other than the community of values. These are laws that member states have signed and should adhere to, including Denmark.
Thank you very much. On this broader question, Janis, Alberto said earlier, solidarity has become a scarce resource in the European Union. And as he was saying, this issue in relation to Dublin, and as pessimistic as you both were about where we get to with that conversation, on that and on the impact of COVID-19 as well. I mean, what is your reading? Fit this into the bigger picture, if you like, of how we talked earlier about that Eurobarometer and how people see the European Union. The success or failure of these negotiations in the long term, how important is it? Same question to both you and Fabian.
I think that it is extremely important, but I will be very harsh now because we have been saying earlier that what we're seeing, especially during the summer at European shores, shores around the Mediterranean especially, is not only a man-made human tragedy, it's a man-made human tragedy. This must not happen. But it's a conscious decision to deal with this challenge in a certain way. And that, I think, is a political tragedy, because the basic decisions which we have taken at the European level is wrong. And I'll just relate that to future potential migration crises, where even the word is wrong. It's not a migration crisis. It's people who are trying to come to Europe for different reasons. And we are creating a crisis out of that. We're managing the situation in the wrong way. But I think that, and that's the unfortunateness, is that we have taken the political decision, whether we are communicating it or not, is that if we are confronted with high numbers, what we will do is we will fight back. We will increase the fences, we will make them higher, we will be pushing back, we will make sure that people will not find it attractive to even try to come to us. So we are going along the route of not showing solidarity not only among ourselves, but showing solidarity with those trying to come to Europe. We're not going along that route. What we're trying is to secure our borders, secure the fact that the numbers of those arriving in Europe is as low as possible, because we fear that we cannot agree on solidarity, and that we also fear that what would be the signal at also the national level and what political consequences it would have if we go another way. So we have succumbed to those who argue, and Fabian was using the word earlier, populists, who use populist rhetoric in terms with respect to the migration crisis. And I think that's a fundamental wrong choice which we have taken. And that is the problem why we are facing with respect to the new pact, but that's a problem which is much bigger, and it is a grave mistake.
Thank you very much. Fabian.
Nothing much to add to what Janis was just saying. I fully agree with that. I think the other side to that I would add is the practical side. It's also by doing things the way we are doing them, we're not actually solving the issues. So we are just creating a situation where this will be a permanent issue. We should be looking not only at our migration and asylum policies, but also at our policies with regard to development, with regard to agriculture, with regard to trade, with regard to external relations. There are many dimensions to this, and develop a comprehensive response where we are actually using some of the tools we have to address the underlying issues. But by having this situation where politically we don't even want to talk about it because it is so difficult, but we are also not addressing any of the issues which need to be resolved.
Absolutely. If you have any questions on this or any other issue, please remember Q&A box or raise your hand. But let me turn now to Schengen and to Helena first on this. Home Affairs Commissioner Ylva Johansson, you mentioned her earlier, described this strategy as a way to quotes, be stronger outwards to be freer inwards. Frankly, I wasn't quite sure what she meant by that. But in terms of what's proposed, what is in this new strategy? What is new about a new strategy here?
Yeah, so I would highlight a couple of things, some of which maybe, are rather in the category of renewed commitments as opposed to concrete proposals or actions. So of course, first off, there's that commitment to limiting introductions of internal border controls to the extent possible. She's mentioned, those being or should be considered as a last resort on numerous occasions. But then we also have a proposal to revise the Schengen evaluation and monitoring mechanism, and to have more unannounced visits so that member states don't have as much leeway. And other aspects are, of course, to boost the political dialogue through annual Schengen fora, and through that comes the hope of rebuilding trust between member states. And finally, we are expected to see a revised Schengen Borders Code at the end of the year. So a lot more to come, but those are sort of the main aspects of the strategy.
And Alberto, from your perspective, in terms of the first pillar of that, the management of the external borders, as Helena was saying, then there's the internal measures, and then there is the evaluation and monitoring, which I'd like to come back to, as whether this is going to build the trust that is needed. But in terms of the EU's broader priorities in relation to the external borders, how does this strategy fit in? Is it a departure? Is it a change of direction, or is it more of the same?
No, it is not a departure from the previous approach. So essentially, the Commission wants stronger, strengthened external borders, and to actually achieve these, as Helena was saying, it's aiming to revamp some of the current systems, some of the current tools, and also to introduce some new ones. For example, the introduction of pre-entry screening of all irregular arrivals, and the implementation of IT systems and smart borders, which have been in discussion, by the way, for many years now. Now, the efforts themselves reflect this general strategy and notion that there can't be an internal borderless area without strong external borders. And in relation to this, I would like to highlight two important issues, I think, that relate to the strategy itself. I think the first one is that the link between internal and external border controls means that when the Commission will eventually come up with a proposal for reforming the rules concerning the reintroduction of internal border controls Helena was discussing about before, this will inevitably become interlinked with the broader discussion and negotiation of the new pact proposals. And I think this will make the current negotiations even more complicated. The second point that I would like to highlight is connected to this one, and also goes back to what Fabian and Janis were saying before, and this concerns the shortage of mutual trust between member states, which also makes implementation more difficult. So stronger external borders evidently also depend on the willingness of so-called frontline states to do a good job at implementing the current and future systems and frameworks. It's frontline states that have been asked to scale up their efforts to systematically check and register all of those who enter the EU, but it's also them who have been accused of not doing enough. So, for example, just a few days ago, Germany, France, and other 4 member states claimed that Greece fails to fulfill its obligations. But we also know that the Greek government rejected all accusations. So the functioning of Schengen, in my view, of course, depends on updated rules, but also depends on mutual understanding and trust. And in a situation where there is so little trust, I think border states will continue to refuse to accept further responsibilities without concrete solidarity efforts, and those states who are instead subject to secondary movements will continue to blame frontline states for not fulfilling their responsibilities and possibly reintroduce internal border controls because of that. So we're going back to square one.
Thank you very much. Fabian, fairly bleak analysis there from Alberto of where we are. This was all designed, it was said, to make Schengen more resilient, more robust. Will it? Could it? It's taken a hell of a battering in the last few years, first from the terrorist attacks, then from COVID-19. Does this do anything, do you think, to really restore faith in, trust in the system and that it can be made to work? Or do you share some of the pessimism we've just been hearing?
Sorry. Yeah, I have to say I'm continue to be pessimistic. I do think that some things can be done to at least give citizens a bit more of a feeling that Schengen is functioning and that they can travel. But at the political level, I still don't see that we found the solutions for some of the key issues which are underlying the difficulties of the Schengen system and which predated the crisis. I mean, we're not talking about something which is new. And as far as I can see, there is no real solution on the table which the member states are willing to sign up to. So in the end, I think what we are going to see is a continued attempt at muddling through, at making sure that things work as well as they can, given the situation we are in, but with no real long-term vision on how we get to a Schengen which is more robust and supported by the member states.
Indeed. I'll bring you in a minute, Janis, but Helena wanted to jump in.
Yeah, very briefly, I think on the question of trust and rebuilding that, I think timing here is really key. If I just go back to the discussion that you had at the start of the update, I think now is maybe not the easiest time to start that process. I think especially, I think in a way we can say, okay, we're safe for the summer, but I think for the fall and for the winter, I personally am not that hopeful. There's of course that emergency brake mechanism, but at the moment, I'm not really sure if there are enough guarantees on the table that member states won't decide again in a way, a bit of a knee-jerk reaction to reinstate internal border controls, simply because there are still quite a few, factors of uncertainty relating to—
Helena, sorry to interrupt, but does that mean this was the wrong time to launch this strategy?
I don't really know if there is ever a good time, but of course there's that expectation that this Schengen strategy would be presented and it was delayed. And so I think in that sense, it's good to have something on paper, but I think it just depends on what aspects of the strategy we're talking about. And I think specifically relating to internal border controls, maybe next year there will be more certainty. We will be, more advanced. We will have a better understanding also in terms of lessons learned. But I think the fall and winter could prove a bit tricky to try and really, sort of counter the approach that was taken in the last year.
Thank you. Janis, pretty bleak picture being painted by everyone else on this as on the pact itself. Your assessment?
I don't think that it's bleak, it's realistic. I think that all colleagues are right. And there is also some sort of negative path dependency. And I think that if we were earlier, and Helena was reminding us of that, discussing of, what are the lessons learned of the COVID-19 crisis? And I think one of the fundamental lessons, there are very detailed lessons, but one of the fundamental lessons is the value of trust, and how significant it is that you trust in each other, not for the sake of trusting, but for the sake of actually being able to deal with the challenge which you're facing. And that, I think, is one of the many also fundamental lessons of this crisis. But then there's negative path dependency. You were saying terrorism, COVID-19, that has all undermined trust. So there's a danger that when we get to the next major challenge, which it will come at some point, that will again undermine trust. And in the difficult dossiers, which migration, asylum questions is definitely one of them, as we have discussed over the past half hour, that will further undermine trust, that there will be this negative path dependency. But let's not forget, when it comes, for example, to the issue of Schengen, if it gets under pressure, at some point, and trying to be positive here, at some point you reach a level where if it becomes existential, member states realize that there will be an enormous negative spillover effect if you kill Schengen, to put it a bit more bluntly, and that it would have enormously negative effects throughout the European Union. So at the end of the day, although there is this reflex, although there is a lack of trust, they do not want to get to the worst of potential options or outcomes, and they want to avoid that. And I think that is something which is, you can say, it's based on a negative assessment of the situation, but at the end, it then leads to a positive reaction, which is do something not to endanger the entire thing, so it becomes an existential crisis.
And on that depressing, but as you say, realistic note, I want to thank you all very much indeed. The EPC will be returning to this topic with a more in-depth discussion on migration asylum policy with Home Affairs Commissioner Ylva Johansson and Portuguese Minister at a policy dialogue next Tuesday, the 15th. Do also watch out for, among other things, an event on Belarus. We talked about that recently in Update on Tuesday as well, and on Thursday, a discussion on EU-Turkey relations. Publications to watch out for. There will be a policy brief published next week on regional recovery in Europe, and there'll be a podcast on the NATO summit. And I'll be back with Fabian and Janis for the next update on the afternoon of June 25th to bring you immediate analysis of what has happened at the EU's regular June summit. So thank you all very much. Thank you particularly to Alberto and to Helena, our guests this week, Fabian, Janis, as always, but most of all, thank you to all of you for joining. I wish you a pleasant rest of the day and a good weekend. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.